Do you go to the supermarket and say, oh, it hasn't increased as much as it increased by last week? I feel wealthy again. No, you think 5 years ago, I earned less and somehow bought more. 5 years ago, this cost half of what it does now. Why is my rent or my mortgage, if you're lucky enough to get a mortgage, still eating so much of my paycheck? The cost of living crisis hasn't gone away. I mean, it's going to return, with a screaming thunder as a result of the Iranian war. It is baffling to me that the Labour Party could have lost sight of it.
An admission for this week's Downstream. It's a very hard conversation to have because we're recording this during the course of the week. We don't know if the Prime Minister is still there come Sunday. What we do know is that British politics is in crisis. You hear that all the time. But when did it start? And what's causing it? In most legacy media, in the print press, in the broadcast media, the BBC, GB News, Sky, they'll say that it's down to idiots, bad people, malicious actors, bad luck. Sure, much of that's true, but it can't explain the fact that we've had 5 consecutive prime ministers who haven't even served a full term in the top job. Clearly, something structural has shifted in British political life. To discuss that and what's causing it, I can think of literally nobody better than today's guest. He helped me start Novara Media 15 years ago, and he is an expert on all things to do with British politics, the law, civil society, and the rest as well. James Butler, it's a pleasure to have you on Downstream.
It's a pleasure.
Look at us with our glasses.
We're aging, that's the problem.
We're aging, we can't see one another without them, can we? We're not here to talk about glasses, as much as maybe we should talk about that on Downstream one day. James Butler's sartorial and aesthetic choices. We're here to talk about that thing you're better known for, which is insightful analysis of British politics. You are one of the very few people, I think, who can talk about British politics, current affairs, culture, the legal aspects of this country at quite a rarefied level, but also use the occasional colourful language, which I've always thought you're a superb voice in this country's media for precisely that reason. Both very high and sometimes lowbrow, which makes you, I think, a captivating voice, but also you offer lots to think about. This has been a crazy week in British politics. When Keir Starmer was elected as Prime Minister in 2024, how did you think the first few years would play out?
Well, I thought they might play out something a little like this. When he won, it was pretty clear that he won partly because the vote moved very strongly away from the Conservative Party. So it was a rejection of the Conservative Party rather than a sort of rush towards the Labour Party. And if you follow the polling trends in the run-up to that campaign and the campaign itself, Labour's vote is already starting to decrease while they're campaigning. So, he has a sort of slightly radioactive quality when he's put in front of the voters. But more importantly, I think those of us who are on the left saw how duplicitous he was in winning the leadership. And it's pretty hard to imagine that wasn't going to continue while in power. It's a pretty unstable coalition he had behind him, no strong base in the Labour Party. And you looked at the manifesto and thought, well, this manifesto is unrealistic. This manifesto wants to do all sorts of things without really taking seriously the fiscal picture. So, there was all of this stuff about, we won't move any taxes, there were sort of tax pledges, we'll adhere to the Tory spending envelope, things like that. And you thought, no, this is going to blow up for you because it's very, very quickly you're going to have to make cuts and they're not going to be very welcome. So winter fuel obviously was the early totemic one, and you can leave that to one side whether you think that's an important, whether you think that's a justified cut or not. There has been a failure to grasp, I think, for lots of the Labour Party, quite how bad things are in the country for lots of people and lots of people who are voting for them. And I think that simply continues to right now. So none of it's particularly surprising. I don't think he's a particularly adept politician. But lots of the problems he encounters are the same problems that have undone various politicians before him. There are problems in this country. There's a political class that is largely unwilling to face them. And so it's not terribly surprising that he finds himself undone by them. Frankly, I think whoever succeeds him, unless they have truly titanic ambition and unless they have truly titanic nerve, is going to encounter the same situation. You look at the polling and you look at the public reception for lots of these leaders, so the successive Tory leaders and then Starmer himself, those relatively rapid descents, I think they're figures that are just going to be repeated until something fundamentally changes. I don't think that the plausible candidates, the immediately plausible candidates, so I'm talking Wes Streeting, Angela Rayner, possibly Ed Miliband, maybe we can talk about that, Andy Burnham at the outside. I don't think they necessarily grasped quite how difficult the situation is.
Here's the thing. You've talked about the long-term challenges of British politics, but also the short-term reality of Starmer, both as the candidate and as the Prime Minister. And you're right to highlight, I think, the fact that Labour's polling fell by 10% between the start of that general election and where they eventually ended up with, 34% of the vote. It fell by 10%. You go back to some opinion polls, I think at the darkest days for the Tories, with Liz Truss and whatnot, I think Labour were polling like 51%. Mm-hmm. So they lost 17%. Nobody realistically thinks they were going to win 51% in the general election, obviously. But they fell some 17% over that period. And that wasn't because the Tories mustered some comeback and reassured their old voters. Something else happened, and much of that was Keir Starmer. So I think that's right to highlight. But there are two things going on here, and I want to sort of pick apart where one starts and the other ends. So there is a structural problem. The last 5 prime ministers in this country, none of them have seen out a full term. That's really new. You know, if you go on Wikipedia and look at the longest serving prime ministers in this country, they're all in the 19th century. You know, it's like people like Lord Liverpool or Walpole, actually the 18th century. And the more recent it gets, you get a few in the 20th century, you know, Blair and you get Thatcher. But clearly in the 2010s, we're descending into something very, very odd. Something really significant has changed. So how much of it is Starmer and how much of it is structural conditions? Because Starmer, it's fair to say Starmer has sought to build, I think, the smallest possible coalition, which meant this was always going to happen. But equally, even if he'd sought to build a bigger one, he'd end up in the same place.
One of the major issues simply is personal and is a question of leadership. Immediately after Labour lost the 2019 election, I spent some time, actually spent a lot of that winter sort of really hitting the classics and doing lots of meditation and sort of trying to detach from the sort of horror that surrounded me after that very bruising election campaign and all the misery that followed. But I spent some time reading Weber, and Weber gave me, Max Weber, important sociologist of the early social democratic period, who gives us lots of insight into what's happening when social democracy is forming, or forming in the way that it continues through the 20th century. And Weber is very interesting on the kind of person who succeeds as a political leader. And I think if you look at that very strange, actually in lots of ways, very strange lecture, Politics as Vocation, which is given to a class of young people, young university students, it will tell you, it has lots of interesting things to say about the perils that are faced by leaders. And so there are personal characteristics that I think are missing in Starmer, sort of that capacity to, for both the kind of quick and reactive while also being able to sort of span the long term. Politics is the slow, hard boring of hard boards. It's the classic line from Weber. There are things that Starmer personally lacks, right? So in a concrete way, that means he's not very good at making clear decisions within his own party, within his own government. That's a real problem because lots in the British system depends on the Prime Minister, much more so than in lots of other systems. The Prime Minister himself, Prime Ministerial government, is very, very central to the way that we operate. One of the other structural factors, and I think it is important, is the way that we have changed how we select leaders of parties. And so this now gets decried quite often. You'll hear it, I think, a lot in the centre and a lot on the sort of centre-right, to a lesser degree, but also there on the centre-left. They rue the idea that we've given members of political parties the ultimate vote over who becomes their leader. And they say, look, there's a problem here because what it does is encourage the kind of people who join political parties, who are hyper engaged, who have perhaps not such mainstream preferences, constrain the choices that MPs can make. Historically, in both Labour and Conservatives, MPs had a much greater role in determining who was going to lead the party. And that means that although getting rid of a leader might not be so difficult, you're very, very uncertain about how you can replace them, because it ultimately ends up in the hands of the kind of people that in the early 20th century, in the formation of the Labour Party, the Webbs called, and they're talking about members of constituency Labour parties here, unrepresentative cranks and fanatics and things like that. Now, as an unrepresentative crank and fanatic myself, I have some sympathy with the kind of people who are denigrated there. To some extent, of course, I think it's perhaps not unreasonable that society as a whole might choose to leave up to people who are very engaged in politics a fine judgment about the kind of people who should be leading. It doesn't necessarily strike me as constitutionally problematic that that's the case. But what it does do is constrain the freedom of movement of people in Parliament, because they don't know that their preferred candidate, once they're thrown upon the members who are deciding, will get through. And that means that you end up in these strange situations where you have someone like, Corbyn is the classic example, who is loved by this electorate and the majority of the Labour Party, not just new people who joined, people who are long-term members of the Labour Party as well. But the kind of people who become Labour MPs are rather less sure of him. But that's an unstable situation. It's not one that can be contained. And so you see that, I think, repeated at various points in the Conservative administrations as well. So it's one of the things that's inhibiting people, I think, right now about removing Keir Starmer, is not being sure about what happens when you go to the selectorate.
Can I quickly respond on that? Because it's something that you hear a lot, right? That we need to fix politics. And like you say, it comes particularly from the centre-right. What I find really interesting, and not many people watching and listening are going to know this, is that in the Tory party, William Hague changed this.
Yes.
William Hague took away power from members to determine their local candidates in a quid pro quo to determine the national leader. So, and even then, of course, there were a bunch of sort of hurdles that had to be jumped. But effectively, the membership decides the national leader, but they don't really get to determine their candidates at the level of Conservative Party associations as they have done in the past. As somebody who's on the left, as a socialist, I'd far rather be able to choose my MP or my parliamentary candidate than a national leader. And if you had an arrangement whereby MPs were entirely determined by local CLPs, Conservative associations, or even by primaries, as they have in the United States, and then those people chose the leader, I'd say, okay, I'm willing to hear that give and take, that political argument. But what you hear from the centre-right is something quite peculiar and actually rather different, which is the MP should determine the leader, and the retinue around the leader should determine the MPs, which means you have this Ouroboros, this snake eating its own tail of political power and authority, entirely insulated from the wider public, which to me is going to create all kinds of democratic deficits and, in the long term, problems of legitimacy, which we saw with Brexit, right? If Hague doesn't change that, if members can still determine their candidates at Conservative Party associations, I'm talking about the Conservative Party here, and they can choose people who are anti-EU, want a referendum, if they could choose those people, we never get the crisis of the Conservative Party. We do really, that means, Cameron goes and then May and then Johnson, and, it's never really recovered after that. So there is an argument to say that Hague's reforms to quote unquote democratise, but actually it was de-democratising the Tory party, they led directly to the collapse of this organisation, which many view as the most successful political party in the Western world. I hope you're enjoying this conversation. I personally learn a hell of a lot on Downstream. It's my favourite part of my work here at Novara Media. I get to talk to all kinds of fascinating people, and the feedback I get from viewers and listeners is broadly positive. Lots of people will say, well, I'm not on the left, I don't watch your other stuff, but I really like Downstream because it's a deep dive into fundamental questions that we really don't see anywhere else in the British media landscape. I think that gets to the heart of what Novara is. We are, in many ways, unique. We're unique in our output, but also in how we're funded. We would not exist without our supporters. Right now, we're launching Novara 3.0, bigger, better, dare I say more ambitious. We want to take on the legacy media. We want to help build a new media for different politics. Having the kinds of conversations, like I say, you don't see anywhere else. And not having them is a big obstacle to moving on. The two-party system isn't just collapsing, it has collapsed. It happened last week. In terms of building something different, something better, well, we'll need a new media too. If you agree with all of that, support our work, go to novaramedia.com/support. We want 2,000 new supporters over the course of this fundraiser. Why not join them and be part of the Novara People's Army?
What we're talking about here, in one sense, is the iron law of oligarchy, and certainly within social democratic parties, the observation that and this is the sociologist who, by English people, is often called Robert Michels, or whatever. And he observes that within, and his studies of trade unions and progressive parties, that these produce, and the famous phrase is, who says organization says oligarchy, right? As a matter of a result of having the bureaucracy you need to administer a complex organization, you produce, or you are likely to produce, a self-perpetuating oligarchy. Now, of course, there are measures that you might take to refresh or broaden the kind of oligarchy that's created in situations like that. But it's an inevitable feature of large, complex organizations. So, people often mistake this for saying, "Oh, it's bad because an oligarchy has been created, and this is inevitable, and therefore all organisation is bad in one way or another." That's not quite right. The question is whether that elite is capable of recognising how ossified it can become and allowing itself to be renewed and reshaped, by the wide span of organisational members that exist. Now, the Labour Party is not very good at doing that, and the trade unions actually are not very good at doing that either. And we can come to talk about those things. I want to say, one other thing and one other factor I think is really important here, which is communicative regime, right? So politics is conducted in the press. It's conducted by media. It has been conducted by media for many, many decades. And the structure of media has changed. It has changed very, very profoundly, even over the course of the now, 15 years that you and I have been doing this stuff, which is in itself a rather sobering thought. It is a real problem that politicians have not moved on from the print and maybe sort of early breakfast show era. That is still the mentality that preoccupies the Labour Party. And things have changed. There is a constant communicative fire hose. It's strongly affective. It's very, very prone to misinformation. It's very, very prone to these kind of highly energized, sort of dopamine-heavy responses. There's lots of that stuff going on. It plays directly into politics. At the moment, there's a story that's sort of bubbling under about the way that AI is helping influencers in third world or global South countries to produce these incredibly inflammatory videos that circulate on sort of boomer WhatsApp and Facebook because they get like $1,500, in the course of a month by doing this. And that's a lot of money. And very often, there's an excellent sort of recent report into this by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, where they contact these guys and say, I don't really know what I'm doing here. I don't know anything about the political context, but what I know is that if I do this, I get money.
Yeah.
And that's a really big problem. And that's a small instance of something that's happening on a much wider scale. So big changes to communicative regime. Other important thing here is that, one aspect of this is that the archive of individual MPs is accessible, right? So the decisions and commitments that individual MPs make at any given point is much, much, much more accessible to the public. They sometimes complain about this. They say, well, you shouldn't be able to see how I voted because I had to vote according to the party line, or I had to vote according to the whip, or whatever. You shouldn't be able to make that kind of judgment. I actually think that judgment is democratic. I think it's a completely reasonable thing for a voter to do. But there is very little getting away from anything you have ever said in public for any politician or indeed any media figure. And that is a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, it means that people can't change positions. It means that things get dug in. It means that things have sort of disproportionate weight. So the whole communicative regime has changed. And I don't think politics has caught up with it at all.
No, I agree with that. You hear this a lot now with Andy Burnham, obviously touted as one of the people who might replace Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, although right now nobody knows quite how that works because he's not a member of Parliament. But you see this with Burnham, of course, people saying that in the past he's been a Blairite, he supported the war in Iraq, all true, by the way. But then look at somebody like Tony Benn, who was Minister of Science, was involved in breaking a strike as a government minister.
Yeah.
So, if that kind of archive existed in the late 70s, early 80s, I doubt he would have been the standard bearer of the Labour left. But people didn't know about things that happened, 20 years earlier in the way they now do. Click of a button, of course, now you can be apprised of all their ghastly acts. Even more than a click of a button, you can just input a question into Google Gemini and say, tell me why Andy Burnham isn't liked by some people. Is he really secretly a Blairite? And you'll get a very articulate and rapid answer. In terms of the communicative regime, and these are long words, but I think people know what you're saying with that, right?
The stuff you read, the stuff you watch, the way that you think about the world, the way politics reaches you, right?
How media changes. I was watching a YouTube short the other day, and it must have been from the 93-94 season. And it was showing Alex Ferguson getting a phone call, and he was being told who was in his group, the Champions League group for Manchester United. And that year it was Galatasaray, IFK Gothenburg, and Barcelona. And he's just on a training ground pitch. You can see, new build houses behind him. Somebody's got a big phone, big old Vodafone. He's got a bit of paper and a pen, and they're saying, these are the teams he's writing. And he looks like a PE teacher.
Yeah.
Right? And this is the mid-90s. He looks like a PE teacher. He looks like how a PE teacher would have looked then. And now, if you look at the same thing, if that's happening, it's all real time. There's a big room. It's all shiny. And Manchester United, FC Barcelona, these are multi-billion-dollar businesses. It's very different. And I think people understand that. And people are saying, you can see in the comments, wow, the 90s was such a nice time. Which is true, by the way. It was nice. There were advantages to all of this. But that's, I think, key. Just how much of this stuff has changed so decisively, so quickly. How not just politics has changed. It's not just had an impact on how we do politics, how we do our daily lives, how we do commerce, how we do social interaction. Completely transformed, often for the worse. But I just want to say this quickly on the Labour thing. They do seem to be uniquely stuck in this old communicative environment. Peter Mandelson was a TV guy, but he was their guru going into the election for 2024. So it is, okay, well, we just need this one clip on the Today programme and this one clip on the 6 o'clock news and this headline. But as you say, that's just, the bottom has fallen out of that way of communicating as a politician, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the astonishing thing about Mandelson, there are many astonishing things about Mandelson, his sort of infatuation with wealth, his sort of long-standing kind of influence over the party, the kind of perpetuation of that influence network. But the most astonishing thing for me is that he's a paper tiger. As you look at, so Wes Streeting, in advance of what he knew would be his leadership bid, released his sort of texts with Mandelson, and Mandelson speaks in banalities. He says, the government should have an economic policy. Oh, should it, Peter? Gosh, thank you for the insight. You think, there should be a two-state solution. Is it still 1996, Peter? And the answer is yes. Actually, for him, it still is, because that mental map has not updated since the mid-1990s. That's where he still is. And there's all sorts of questions that arise as a result of that. I was thinking of the very famous observation that Hegel made about, in his time, the morning newspaper replacing morning prayer, right? And so what he's saying, it's a line from the Aesthetics, I think. And he says, the shared thought world that used to be constituted by morning prayer, the shared regime, that shared routine, that even if you didn't know the people, down the street or in another town, you knew that you did the same things and you shared those words and you shared those kind of conceptual universes. That was replaced in that communicative regime by the morning newspaper, right? So everyone was sat around the breakfast table with perhaps the paterfamilias with his kind of big broadsheet newspaper, reading the same things as every other paterfamilias in every other bourgeois household around the country. And so there was a shared regime there. Now, the broadcast era, in Britain in particular, used to have a very constrained set of channels. So you have something similar, very much a shared thought world. Now, people don't get up in the morning and read their newspaper anymore. They get up and scroll their individuated feed of, mad TikTok videos. Well, I don't use TikTok, I'm afraid.
Novara Media accepted, of course.
Yes, of course. But there is something important there in sensing that this fire hose of content actually is individuated and it isn't necessarily shared with other people. Yeah. So your sense of the world has changed very, very profoundly, in that time. Last thing to observe about this, and this is really the big zoom out question, is one way of looking at the 20th century is that the 20th century is the century of social democracy, right? It's a century in which this idea is formulated about how, and I'm talking in very, very broad terms here, about how you might reorder society in a just and egalitarian way. And it has various expressions. It has expressions in German social democracy, has, of course, expressions in Russian social democracy. It has expressions in the Labour Party in England, and so on and so on and so on. It's a very, very, it is the idea in some ways, particularly of the early 20th century. And lots of conservatisms arise in opposition to it. One of the stories of fascism is fascism is arising in reaction to the march of social democracy. There are lots of other things going on as well, but that story and Christian democracy arises in reaction in Germany and in Italy to the march of social democracy as a way of finding something that can speak to the things that are dynamic about it while reacting to it. Now, my reading is that social democracy was partly dependent on having a communicative world like that, one that was shared. And it might be that one of the problems that we're seeing arising symptomatically in British politics is that the lack of that shared world means it's quite hard to find the coordinates for doing social democracy. And whereas through the course of the 20th century, social democracy itself was agentive, was in some ways the kind of prime mover of the political system, so conservatisms of various kind arise in reaction to it, perhaps it is the case that reactionary conservatisms of various kinds are now finding their own kind of motion, right? So they're not acting purely in reaction to something coming from, say, the organised workers' movement, such as it is. And that's a very difficult situation for people on the left to be in because it's a very new one. It's a very concerning one in lots of ways. It's a very new one. People don't, there's a reason that everyone's behaving confused.
I mean, you're saying the beginning of the 20th century, the formation of radical social democracy or social democracy, and the right has just been responding to it ever since. I think that's true. I mean, some would say since the French Revolution, right? And what you're maybe contending is that is no longer the case. We don't know.
We don't know.
We're the foothills of this thing, right?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that there's a profound change that has happened. And it's visible, I think, one of the ways it's actually really interesting and actually played out in the elections that we've just had is that, okay, if you ask a person who's not a kind of crazy politics nerd, what was the biggest mass membership political party in the 20th century in Britain? Probably they'd say the Labour Party, I guess. But it's not true. It's nowhere near true. It's the Conservative Party. In the mid-1950s, it has something like 2.5, maybe 3 million.
I think getting towards 3, right?
Yeah, 3 million members. Because it is this hugely thick social organisation. It's a thing that organises people's social lives, particularly in rural England. So, if you want to find a nice, respectable boy today and you're a young daughter of a wealthy family, you go to the local Conservative Association dances. Now, I think it's very arguable. It's an argument that Richard Crossman makes, former Labour cabinet minister, in his own way, very brilliant. He makes the argument that that thick kind of conservative movement arose in response to the Labour Party forming itself in the early 20th century. I think that's right. I think it's pretty incontestable that that's the case. In both cases, they are completely hollowed out. I mean, local conservative associations are nothing like they used to be. They simply no longer have that social role. But it's the same story can be told of constituency Labour parties. Always much more kind of politically focused than local Conservative associations. But they are simply, they are really the domain of very, very few people now, many of whom are involved in professional politics or wish to be or are retired.
Yeah, that point about Conservative associations and that 3 million figure by the 50s, I think is really lost on a lot of people. And it's not just, young people trying to find a partner. It's men that just want to get cheap alcohol.
Yeah.
Cheap bite to eat while watching the Grand National or the Cheltenham Cup on telly. I remember in Bournemouth just growing up, even in the 1990s, around the town, there were 5 or 6 Conservative clubs. Michael recently went to China, which he won't stop talking about, our colleague Michael Walker. And he's saying that the party provides, this, and you can read about the ideology, and there's the bust of this person, and there's subsidised food here. European social democracy, but also the centre-right used to do all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And it betokens the complete dissolution of actually serious civil society. Civil society doesn't, maybe this is one of my, hyperbolic moments. Civil society doesn't exist in this country. It doesn't exist. Trade unions don't exist. Conservative associations don't exist. Churches don't exist. Mosques exist. And I think that's partly one of the reasons why you see the rise of Islamophobia is because just because there is so little by way of organised civil society, expressions of organised civil society, Islam becomes so much more conspicuous. So in a way, I actually understand it, right? Yes, those people are behaving in an entirely different way to almost everyone else. You're right. But that's not how it used to be. There's an associational life with one part of the country which used to be the norm. And I think, that's something that really really merits thinking about, but we don't really do it. Also Mandelson, the text with Streeting, where he's just basically giving out platitudes, it's like ChatGPT, Peter Mandelson version. Well, we have to offer market-friendly policies, and we have to think about the interests of business, but we need to offer our progressive flank something positive. I heard David Lammy say the same nonsense on the night of the local elections last week. There is nothing there. You're right. He is a paper tiger, and you're right. He is still stuck in the world of 1996. But I wonder the extent to which that's also true of the entire political class, because they all say the same thing. Well, of course, I believe in a two-state solution. Nobody believes in a two-state solution. Nobody. Well, of course, I'm pro-business. Therefore, I want to reduce taxes, as if that means the same thing. Well, we tried that in the early 2010s, and that did happen. There was a cut to the top rate. There was a cut to corporation tax. We didn't see a flourishing of business, actually. And it is remarkable to me, James, and maybe explain this. It's remarkable to me that 17 years after the global financial crisis, almost 20 years after the release of the first iPhone, more than 20 years after Facebook, YouTube, all this stuff has been around for a really long time. Three decades after the emergence of knowledge workers as a thing in our political culture, they're still talking about this stuff, and they're not thinking in sort of original, innovative ways in terms of how to solve problems. Why is that? I look at China. I mentioned China, not that it has everything right, but people say, well, the left isn't interested in supply-side economics. What do you think China is doing? They've socialized finance primarily to give their industrial actors a major advantage by giving them cheap credit. That is a supply-side thing, but it doesn't seem to have cut through to the media and political class in this country, and I wonder why.
I find the behaviour of lots of MPs incomprehensible in lots of ways. I also find them eminently predictable, right? It's a strange combination, that you're given a sort of certain... it's almost like these people come into Parliament and they're sort of fixed in aspect at the time that they arrive. It may well be that some of them are fixed in aspect at the time they leave university or get their first job. It's perfectly possible. It is nonetheless curious, and partly I think it's because there are strong incentives to select for loyalty over innovation or intellectual novelty or intellectual skill. So, one way of looking at this problem is to say, okay, well, what do you need to do to be selected as an MP? Well, the answer isn't to be an innovative and disruptive local leader. The answer is to cultivate the network within a sort of certain section of the party who can kind of grease the pole. And I should point out there are, of course, investigations ongoing into sort of rather unpleasant sounding allegations about vote rigging in Croydon. And certainly it could go well beyond that with the system used within the Labour Party to select for... to vote for candidates.
A non-voter.
A non-voter.
Just for people who aren't aware, you can Google it.
Yeah. So, so that to one side, that would be hard sort of rigging or hard sort of fixing. But there's a lot of kind of greasing that goes on, and there's a lot of, networking that goes on. What you're doing there is demonstrating that you'll be a loyal foot soldier. And then, okay, you get selected to your council position or to your, to your backbench position. And there, your job also is to be a loyal soldier, is to take the directives, take the flak. So, go out there and defend something that is in one way or another completely indefensible. Demonstrate to the leadership that you're willing to compromise yourself in that way. And you might find yourself getting a promotion. So you can see how people are incentivized. I mean, it's just an obvious sociological thing that people are incentivized. If you have any sort of dignity or self-respect, there's a point at which you say, okay, either I become sort of an awkward squad MP on the backbenches and make life difficult for these people, or I just give up on, any sort of sense of self-respect. And maybe one day when I'm a Secretary of State, I'll be able to change things for the better. You think that's often the compromise that goes on, but it obviously doesn't work.
No.
Are there solutions to these things? I mean, there are. As you've suggested, letting some more democratic air into the system at various points would help. Beyond that, I think it's very hard to know exactly how to avoid that kind of oligarchical self-reproduction and influence network.
So what's the main reason why the two-party system's in collapse? Because you say on the one hand, communicative regime, I think that's a big reason why, right? It's lowered the cost of entry for an organisation like the Greens to actually get councillors, to get MPs, to have a national voice, and then you can build on that, and you get one MP, then 4 MPs, and probably the Greens will get dozens of MPs in the next election. Yes, Reform have fundraised a ton of money from donors, that's true, big money. Some of the biggest donations in party political history in this country have gone to Reform, but that's only because they demonstrated before they got the money that they could win seats and basically take down the Conservative Party. So the community environment is one aspect of the collapse of the two-party system, which is happening. I mean, I don't even think it's happening. I think it has happened by evidence of last week's local elections. But then you're saying also that the two major parties are themselves contributing to their own collapse by not selecting for a wide range of candidates. It does feel to me like that's particularly a problem for the Labour Party. We heard from Keir Starmer and the people around him in 2024 that their selection process was about getting the brightest and the best, and yet there are remarkably few people that seem capable of replacing him on Labour benches. And in defence of Keir Starmer, that didn't start in 2024, that goes back a really long way. And we have to be totally frank here, Jeremy Corbyn, in my view, did not increase the intellectual firepower of the Parliamentary Labour Party. He didn't. You'd have to be very foolish to think that, I think. So clearly, there's a lot going on. The people in politics aren't smart enough. The ideas aren't wide-ranging enough. The communicative environment as well. How do these rank? Like, what do you think is the main cause here of the collapse of the two-party system?
As you were speaking, I was reminded of an observation that Nye Bevan made in a chapter in Place of Fear, which is the book he wrote as a sort of major intervention into, or sort of summation in some ways of his brand of Labour politics. There's a chapter which is basically advice to a new MP. And, he sort of actually steals the phrase from Marx. He says that, that Parliament lies like an Alp on the mind of the new member. And it's, he uses a phrase something like it's the most powerful of social shock absorbers. And he says, the experience of the new Labour MP, this is a time of someone who has emerged from a working class community, is that he comes into this palace full of these images and things that are not of his people and not of his background, and then comes into the chamber to deliver his maiden speech. And it's as if it's sort of delivered into a sort of polite, indifferent silence that achieves nothing. So in a sense, this problem is very old, right? Like the chamber in Westminster is very, very good at absorbing social shocks and differences and difficulties. I do think there has been a change in the use of the chamber in general. You see many more MPs reading speeches. You're actually not supposed to read a speech in the Commons. You're supposed to speak spontaneously or with a couple of notes in front of you. You can see that MPs are rising to deliver speeches that they're intending to have clipped for social media. So the thing that's important to them is out there rather than in here. Now, not all of the work of Parliament goes on in the chamber, of course, but it's quite an important bit of it. And the notion that you could have some sort of genuine debate going on in there is probably quite an important one. I think one of the other issues here is this problem, this sort of centrifugal force in politics, this pulling away from the old centre, is something that is being repeated in various other European polities, right? So we're actually not that distinctive. It's a point that's worth reiterating to people who think Britain is exceptional. There are lots of strange features in Britain, but the old German parties of right and left are not doing brilliantly. The parties in the Netherlands are doing pretty poorly. The Spain is an interesting but also sort of difficult case. France, it does not look wonderful, and so on and so on. So none of these things, it doesn't look great anywhere. One of the things that exacerbates it, however, in the British situation is that the kind of political negotiations that in a more representative system, so a system that has proportional representation rather than ours, things that are negotiations between parties, right? So let's say you have a block of left-wing parties that have various fractions of the vote, but they make up a majority between them. You would expect, in the course of a negotiation, for parties to kind of press their points of what they desire and form a compromise in a left or progressive government as a result. In Britain, it doesn't happen like that. Those views, historically, are represented as basically factions within the Labour Party. And what happens is what are inter-party negotiations elsewhere are intra-party factional wars in Labour. That has ceased to be a useful way to do politics. I don't think it necessarily ever was.
You're saying it ceased, but it feels like Keir Starmer destroyed it. Because even Blair had more left-wingers in his cabinet before Iraq than Keir Starmer does. Something like Claire Shaw simply would not be in Keir Starmer's cabinet.
Yeah.
Robin Cook.
Yeah.
John Prescott.
Yeah, it's been the case across the board that governments are more ideologically coherent, both in Conservative and Labour governments, than they would have been historically. Of course, the key moment here is Johnson expelling various One Nation Tories from his party, with the wave of a hand.
Can I actually just come back on this, a few of these things? So, what you said from Nye Bevan and this idea of the parliamentarian goes into the Houses of Parliament for the first time, and it's an alienating experience. When I say alienating, it's alienating them from the people they've been deigned to represent. They go in there as representatives of people from whatever part of the country, and it's alienating them from both that purpose and those people, those communities. Ralph Miliband says something very similar. He says, rather than having socialists in Parliament, we have parliamentary socialists. There's a big difference. We need socialists in Parliament, but the way that the institution works, the politesse, like you say, just purely the optics, the grandeur of the place, undermines people's recognition of that. Not always, of course. Somebody like Nye Bevan knew that. Keir Hardie, when he first made his maiden speech in Parliament, I think was shouted down by the Tory benches because he said something which was just, completely unacceptable to them. But that's generally the default experience. And so I think this is interesting because, we're talking about the collapse of the two-party system, and we're saying one of the reasons is that the quality of MPs is not sufficient. There's too much ideological homogeneity. One explanation for that could be, they're just stupid, they're idiots. Well, no, actually, this is partly an expression of the point of Parliament in the first place, and that's been documented for a really long time. And we're going to talk about first past the post more in a minute. I want you to tell me what it is, James Butler, the oracle of the British Constitution. But, there is a good comparative case. I know you're saying that this is happening everywhere in Europe. There is clearly a crisis of legitimacy authority for the incumbent parties in less in Spain, actually, but in Germany, in Italy, in France, in those countries, a few others as well. Less so
Not
in
going
the
brilliantly in the
Nordics.
Netherlands.
Less in the Nordics. The Netherlands is a crazy system anyway in terms of how proportionate it is. But yeah, those are three really big countries, right? France, Italy, Germany. That's the sort of engine historically of the Eurozone. They have similar issues, but of course, like you say, they have PR, which makes it easier for newcomers to land in Parliament. The whole point of first past the post is you have a two-party system by design. And if you're a comparative politics scholar, you then point to the United States. And what is happening right now in Britain is analogous to somebody running for the presidency and coming second 1 year, and then 4 years later somebody wins it, right? If Reform are the largest party, or when you get the midterms, new parties and independents winning all over the country. That's not happening in the US, but it's happening in Britain. And I can only put that down to primaries, really. Primaries have been the shock absorbers that have stopped, the formation of third and fourth and fifth parties in American politics. And that's not just true on the left, historically. You now see the left, huge energies on the left of American public life have gone into the Democratic Party because of the primary system via AOC and Zoran Mamdani and so on. And that gives that party a whole new wave of legitimacy with millions of people that it was losing. Same on the right with Trump, with the Tea Party people. And we don't have that here. And what I find strange is the exact same people who love the West Wing box sets, and they have the poster of JFK, and they're very America pilled. They love anything to do with America. If you say we should have primaries, they start to recoil and they compare you to Joseph Stalin.
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's often because in those cases that it would remove predictability from the system that they intend to be elected in at some point. The comparison, of course, between the United States and the UK is an interesting one. One way of looking at primaries and their role in American politics is to say that, well, they actually do have a two-stage system. They have a two-stage system like lots of other states do, and Britain doesn't. And primaries are the first stage of that. There's a very clear kind of structural role about sort of deciding where preferences lie within a party before they proceed to what looks like a single round electoral campaign. So we don't have that. We just have our system, which is a strange system in lots of ways. It's a system that has its virtues. It has historically produced relatively strong results, relatively clear results. It has tended towards, as you've said, a sort of duopoly. It's important to say it is really, really very old, right? I mean, it goes right the way back to the high medieval period, where you have sort of, clear elections by block and by signalling and things like that. So, this is a period in which you have sort of multi-member constituencies. These run up right until the 19th century. Really, not until the 20th century are they cleared up. So we have a system now which is in the kind of garments of the old system. Nonetheless, is relatively modern. We have relatively equal-sized constituencies with one MP. Didn't necessarily used to be the case.
As a man who went to Oxford, you'd have had two MPs.
I know, I'd have had two MPs. Isn't it outrageous?
Until 80 years ago?
Yeah. So there used to be constituencies for the university seats, which produced lots of great politicians. Pitt, for instance, is sat for the universities. There are arguments for systems like that. I think that I'll stick with the one that we have. I think I don't think I need to return to the university system. But yeah, there are problems with it. So one of the problems is the Condorcet loser problem, right? Where there's a candidate who wins, even if they were head-to-head with all the other candidates on the ballot, they'd lose each of those contests individually. This situation that sometimes happens. There's a frustrated majority problem. It can lead to, it tends to lead to a sort of duopoly politics, like we've historically had here and still have in the United States. One of the arguments, as you've made in your observation about new parties, is that it is a bulwark against extremism, right? So that a new political formation that is, say, anti-systemic or has a kind of criticism of the sort of mainstream will find it hard to get representation in Parliament, usually because their support will be very, very dispersed and they won't win lots of seats. So this is the case with Reform in the last general election. Substantial chunk of the vote, I think 14% or something like that, 5 seats. That's clearly not a just outcome, however much one might be thankful for it and, not going to lose any sleep over it. But, it's democratically frustrating and is something that actually you can trade on. The other thing here is that when those parties do eventually succeed, they really succeed. So rather than having them as an element of the political system that has to, where they have responsibilities and are brought into negotiations and brought into the political process, they tend to build until they take the whole board. That could be the situation we're looking at in 2029.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the fascinating one for me in terms of PR, is that the Conservative Party might suddenly flip and say, we are now the party of PR, not least because parties on the centre-right and the centre, with regards to coalitions that come out of PR, because you always govern by coalition, they tend to do really well. The FDP in Germany, tiny party, I don't think they're even in Parliament anymore, but they're often in government because they can work with the Greens, they can work with the SDP, they can work with the centre-right, the Christian Democrats. And you can imagine the Conservatives as a party on the right, but not quite where Reform are, doing quite well out of PR actually in this country. They could sometimes govern with Reform, sometimes with the Lib Dems, sometimes with the Greens, sometimes with Labour. Whether or not they're smart enough to do that, I don't know. The Conservative Party as an institution has an ego for a reason. It's been around for hundreds of years. I think let's just recapitulate those points for a moment. First past the post, what are the strengths? Stable, big mandates, constituency link is one you didn't mention, stops extremists. And on all of those levels, I can see how it's just not doing it anymore. So constituency link. Who thinks that their MP is a really good representative of their constituency anymore? There are people saying, but hold on.
I have a controversial take on this. I don't care. I really don't care.
Well, it does depend. I mean, look, if you're in the... Okay, so if you're in Durham and Luke Akehurst has literally never set foot in Durham before, maybe.
Sure.
But that's what's happening. Sure. Or Alex Barros-Curtis, this guy had never won an election to the Labour Party at any level, internal, NEC, nothing.
But he was a functionary, Aaron.
He was a functionary.
It's much more important than winning an election.
He was the legal officer, I think. He was the compliance officer for Owen Smith and then for...
Yeah, legal for that case that lost the party loads of money, right? Yeah.
Millions of pounds, actually. But he's now the MP for Cardiff somewhere, Cardiff West, I think, something like that. He's never been in Cardiff before. I know what you're saying. I do think the constituency link is somewhat important. Not for all MPs. If somebody's a really talented MP, you find them a seat. I get that. But I don't think the public thinks in any case that now, a strength of first past the post is we have the constituency link. So it's not giving stability. It's not stopping, quote unquote, the extremes. I don't think the Greens are extreme. And we have to be honest, by the standards of the European sort of countries, Reform aren't extreme. They have sister parties. You might not like them. You might think they say extreme things, but they're not unusual in the context now of democratic European systems. So it's not stopping that. It's not giving us clarity. We've had a ton of hung parliaments recently, actually. And then you get parties that don't win very much in terms of the vote, getting a huge majority. Labour did that in 2005 as well. And I think what's interesting with first past the post and without primaries is that the system which led to stability is now creating profound instability, precisely because first past the post without primaries has no mechanism by which it can renew itself.
Yeah. I agree. I think that's right. I mean, one thing I'm sure we'll come to is, of course, the impact of devolution and the question of how this relates to the various devolved administrations, the Parliament in Scotland and the Senedd in Wales. These are important factors in why this might all feel like it's coming apart. I mean, obviously, historically, Scotland and Wales are very, very important for the Labour Party in particular. In some ways, there's a really scandalous aspect of the way the elections that took place on May 7th have been treated by correspondents in Westminster, which is to treat the English local elections as somehow more catastrophic than Welsh Labour being essentially obliterated in what is, historically, the emotional, psychological, intellectual, rhetorical root and heartland of the party. I mean, that is, there's lots of sentimentality about this stuff, but I think it's inarguably true that Labour would not be Labour without Wales, and now Labour barely exists in Wales. That is, in some ways, much more damning than having lost some English councils, having been sort of stomped on by reform in various places. And the fact of that distance is part of why. The fact that it isn't taken seriously is, of course, part of why that's happened. Now, there's lots of stuff about Labour's actual incumbency in Wales, which has not been very good. There's all sorts of criticisms that can be levelled at Welsh Labour there. Those are rightful criticisms. But the failure of the weirdly parochial nature of political journalists, I'm sure I've been guilty of it at various points as much as anyone else. But it is astonishing to anyone with a kind of historical grasp of how these movements happened in the course of the 20th century, that it's not taken more seriously. I don't know why that is.
Well, Wales is a small nation, right? England is 58 million people, but it's still 3 million people. I mean, it's still quite a lot of people, right? 3 million people is many countries. And if you look at the sort of political legacy of Labour, its heritage in Wales, people talk about Nye Bevan, of course, I think from Tredegar, but there's also Jim Griffiths. He was in the same government with Attlee in 45. He's responsible for child benefit. He's responsible for, I think, the principle of national insurance contributions. So this whole edifice of, NHS, child benefit, national insurance, this is from two guys that were working in mines or were colliery workers. I think Griffiths was a surface colliery worker from the age of 12. Mm-hmm. The party general secretary with that government from 45 to 50, again, a Welshman. So it goes to the heart of the apogee of social democracy in this country, the role of Welsh political figures, politicians. And like you say, the media doesn't seem to care. And unlike in England where, they've been dislodged in some authorities by, Reform and the Greens, which is quite legible, isn't it? Reform are kind of like the Tories, and the Greens are taking out their sort of Corbynista vote. And the Lib Dems are kind of the more moderate Blairite. You can understand. That's not always true, of course, but it's understandable. In Wales, they've literally been replaced by a Welsh nationalist party. That's a quite a big shift. Yeah. And the incuriosity of that is really something to behold. I have to say, of course, Novara Media's coverage of Wales was exemplary. I went to Merthyr Tydfil.
One of the very few national organisations to take it seriously.
Yeah, and this was something I've spoken to a few people in the media about it, and they say, "Oh, great documentary," and this was good. I'm like, where are the BBC? Where is Sky? And we did 3 or 4 stories. I'm obviously going to talk about my ones because I know them. I help make them. Birmingham and Wales, South Wales in particular. We knew that these were huge stories. Why wasn't there more of a national conversation about it? But instead, we're talking about sort of political gossip. And Michael Walker would say, well, that's because, it's because of the attention economy and it's because of clicks and it's because of... That's all true. But also, there are just lots of journalists in London who don't want to leave London. They're just really lazy. One exception is somebody like Lewis Goodall, right? And it's so noticeable precisely because nobody else bloody does it.
But I mean, it helps that Goodall's from Birmingham and would have known that story is coming. But yeah, I mean, he's just much more interested in the country than
he's curious in Britain, which I say that's a huge generalisation. Many political journalists are not that curious about the country.
Well, I mean, they think it's readable by numbers, and and I think lots of things are readable by numbers, right? Numbers and statistics really help us, but they can also be very badly misinterpreted. The piece I wrote immediately after these elections for the LRB, I pointed out, as is inevitable, there's a risk of an ecological fallacy that politicians in particular, but often journalists fall into as well, which is where you look at the top line numbers of a constituency and say, oh, okay, Labour's vote has gone down by 20% and Reform have got 20%. That must mean that they're switching from Labour to Reform. Well, actually, lots of other stuff can be going on under the hood. There's all sorts of ways that vote transfers can work out. There can be differential turnout between people voting for one party or not. Look, I mean, to be honest, if you're a Labour voter in these elections, you might say, well, look, I don't really fancy the Green candidate because they're a mental hippie or something. I don't fancy the Reform candidate.
I'd vote for them for that reason.
I mean, that's why I vote for them. But I don't want to vote for the Reform guy because he's a bit of a nutcase. But my Labour candidate is some sort of flown in McKinsey drone who sort of has set foot in the constituency or set foot in my ward maybe twice, whatever, or you just think, you know what, I can't be, they've not won my vote. I'm just going to stay home. I can't be asked. Is it that significant? Maybe I'll just send a message by not voting for them. So that was the case in last year's local elections when there was lots of panicking about all these Labour voters switching to Reform. Let me be very clear: there are Labour voters who switched to Reform. That's the thing that's happened. You can add to them lots of voters who may once have voted Labour, often 20, 30 years ago, and who have fallen out of the habit, have been non-voters. Some of those are reactivated into voting for Reform. But actually, lots of the Labour transfer is to other parties within their sort of general progressive bloc. Yeah. So Greens, Liberal Democrats in various places, things like that. So, I'm independent candidates actually in lots of places as well. So, so numbers can mislead you about a place. It's important it is important to speak to people. You get a very, very thick social understanding by being in a place and looking candidates in the eye, speaking to people. And those two things combined are really, really important.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. In Portsmouth South, where I live, it's got a Labour MP, I suspect not for very long. Although it's a Labour Lib Dem marginal, so, it's one of those where stop reform argument might help. That's unusual. There are not very many Labour Lib Dem marginals. And the Greens did super well across the whole of Portsmouth, actually. And I'm looking at the ward breakdowns, and they're second, third, fourth, second, and it's both north and south, very different parts of the city, but actually just they're very different seats. One is very much a reform target. I think the south could be a green target. They're very, very different. And I'm looking at all of it. I'm saying to my wife, she's a councillor still, just about in Portsmouth, and I'm saying, this is really crazy how balanced that green vote is. You're getting in quite leafy, prosperous places, but they're doing just as well in more working class, blue collar areas. Really surprising. And then the Lib Dems in some wards, sort of Saddam style majorities, to quote unquote stop reform, and you have a very charismatic or effective councillor. And like you say, all that's just missed out. Or my wife's saying to me that on the morning of the vote, there were certain polling stations where, reform candidates were going to vote. They were being treated like royalty. People were going, yeah. It was a carnival atmosphere, which I remember in the 2019 European elections. I remember going to a polling station in the 2019 European elections, again in Portsmouth, and there were whole families turning up, blokes wearing T-shirt and shorts with the kids and the wife. These are not normal voters in European elections. They might have been a general election, but, European elections, 35% turnout, and they were going to vote for the Brexit Party. And then I switch on the TV, and, there's Alistair Campbell saying, no, people secretly want to stop Brexit. And I'm thinking, well, this isn't a Labour seat. And I'm seeing loads of people like this, and ultimately, the Brexit Party did very well in those elections. What I'm seeing is so at odds with, like you say, the ecological fallacy, you call it?
Yeah.
People just looking at the numbers. Well, if all those voters go from here to there, sort of moving tanks on a game of Risk or something, you're moving your battalions around. That's not how voters work.
Yeah. I mean, and it's one of the interesting things about this set of elections, right, is that actually, if you're Nigel Farage coming out of these elections that we've just had, you probably aren't actually feeling that great, because actually, you probably, if you wanted to retain the kind of momentum that you had last year, you really should have been posting quite, I think the benchmark was about 2,000. You want about 2,000 seats, 2,000 new councillors. And they really didn't get anywhere near that. And that's important. That tells us that in these elections, in England, in those places that were up, they didn't do so well. The momentum does seem to have slowed. And there are, very sophisticated mathematical models that suggest that's the case. You use these results to project projected national share, so it's called. But you wouldn't know that from Farage's reaction, and you wouldn't know that, I think, from the general mood. And I think that's interesting. I think it tells you that politics isn't just a question of numbers. It's a question of animal spirits, as it were, and the capacity to build cohesive and creative stories. What I mean here, and what is important here, is that those on the left should not completely despair looking at the reform surges. There are signs that there might be a ceiling here. There are signs that the numbers are stabilizing in such a way as to be confined to a relatively predictable conservative or reactionary bloc. I could look like a fool in a few years' time when they sweep all before them. That's certainly possible, and the nature of the system makes that much less predictable than it used to be. It might well be that if they win 30% in a general election and everything else is fragmented, they really could sweep all before them.
Another loveless landslide.
Yeah, but, I think they'd use it quite a lot better than Keir Starmer has. Just to say one last thing on the electoral system, I think that is important. It has long been the fantasy of various people on the left that one reason to reject proportional representation, to say that it's not a thing that we would want to pursue, or reform of the electoral system in general, is that in an ideal situation in which the left has command of the Labour Party, has eliminated the various kind of factional counteractors within the party, has made a convincing case to the country, wins a majority sufficient to act in Parliament, is not immediately blown up by the banks, then it has supreme legislative power and can achieve all it wants to do overnight in a single Parliament. Well, okay, sure, maybe. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon, guys. And there are some things that need to change. So I think in some ways that fantasy of kind of supreme power is an illusion. And it's the kind of illusion that keeps people from embracing reality at times. And it can be very destructive and produce all sorts. It's one of the reasons sectarianism within the Labour Party is so vicious and within the sort of electoral left is so vicious, is that there is the belief that there is this prize that is sort of somehow just out of reach, and that if you can eliminate all your enemies or make everyone agree with you, or at least stamp on them hard enough that they have to, then you can grab it. And I just don't think that's the case. I think political power is actually much more distributed than that. I think the efficient structure of the British Constitution is such that actually there are all sorts of bulwarks of resistance, that you need much more complex kind of political strategies to deal with than just like, when we've got the thing, then we've won.
Yeah. It was Ramsay MacDonald, who was the first Labour Prime Minister, who said, we don't need a Bolshevik revolution in this country. I can't remember the quote because it was presumably between 1917 and when he became the PM in 29. He said, we don't need a Bolshevik revolution in this country because we have parliamentary sovereignty. And, we just need to win a majority in Parliament. And it's basically the same thing. There's some truth to that. Before you have the Supreme Court, etc., that there was an extraordinary amount of power invested in that Parliament. And this is the sort of the mindset that's being appealed to. But that was a world where Britain had an empire that was, a quarter of the planet's surface, one of the leading industrial powers. You didn't have Scottish and Welsh nationalism. You didn't have a Supreme Court. You didn't have a European Union. You didn't have the WTO. And it's just ridiculous that people still try and inhabit that world. And I think you're right. It's just to ignore present realities. But another part of that isn't just the constitutional setup. And I find this a lot. And, I'm sure people watching or listening again would disagree with this. But people say, well, look, we built the welfare state in 1945. We had 200% debt to GDP, but we built the NHS. We built a modern, like I say, welfare state. We rebuilt the country. We rebuilt the military. We had huge, percentage of GDP on military spending right into the mid-1950s. Why can't we do it again? Well, I'm happy to tell you why. We don't have the largest currency union in the world, the sterling area. We aren't, I think in 1946, Britain was the world's #1 manufacturer of cars. More than the US, more than Germany, obviously, more than the Soviet Union for 1 year. But regardless, until the 1950s, early 50s, it was the top 3 manufacturers of cars. It's not, you can't compare that country to this country. It, of course, has overseas colonies. You can get rubber from Indonesia. You can get oil from Persia. These are cheap factors of production, right? None of that exists anymore. So again, it's this weird mental landscape that people are living in, which might as well be a different world. You might as well be in sort of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. I can't really think of one. It's like living in China And rather than talking about the future at the early 20th century, saying, we want to be like the Song dynasty 1,000 years ago. The world is that different now for Britain and its place in the world. Again, we're constantly arriving at the same answer, which is people aren't facing up to reality.
I think that's right. And one of the reasons for that is intellectual training. And so I think the political conversation in Britain, weirdly, for a country that has such a long and complex and interesting political history, is very stunted. It basically treats 1945 as year zero. I mean, if you're lucky, 1945 is year zero. Quite a lot of the time, 1979 is year zero.
Or 97 for the really.
Yeah, I mean, or
for the really,
1997. And arguably one of the things, one of the periods that's much more like what's happening now is the early 20th century, where you're looking at a big ideological realignment and huge and very painful and rather slow and protracted sort of shift in representation. Arguably, that's an arc that extends from the Reform Acts in the 19th century all the way through to, say, 1918 or something like that. So that's a big, long and protracted change, which gives us the sort of modern parliamentary system, basically. Things change a bit again after the wars. And as you say, I mean, one other factor, of course, in 1945 is that there's lots of Marshall Plan cash swimming, swilling around in Europe. So, there's lots of stuff there that's not really replicable. On the other hand, I do think there is, one of the things that is worth saying is that there is a kind of consensus of despair that I think has set in across the ideological spectrum, right? That says, basically Britain is fucked, and there's not very much we can do other than maybe, some more taxes here, or maybe like juice some productive industries at the edges here and there. Maybe we can swill some more cash into, move some civil service back offices to some other place and create 100 jobs here or something. One of the things that is frustrating about this government is that somewhere in the Starmerite package is a recognition that actually a government-led investment program might well unleash productive capacity. And, that is the only thing that will get the country, out of the unfortunate pit that it's found itself in. This idea that we're, as much as I didn't think there was a serious plan for it, it's not wrong for the country to want to be, to have the number one sustained GDP growth in the G8. Now, I mean, look, that is not going to happen. But, aiming for it is not a bad idea. I don't think many of the policies were geared or pursued as coherently as that might be. I thought there was something completely incoherent about accepting the Conservative spending envelope. I thought there was something completely, frankly, insane about, structuring expenditure such that there would have to be necessarily huge cuts in the second half of this Parliament, according to Rachel Reeves's projections. I mean, one of the baffling things about anyone fighting to succeed Starmer if he goes, which who knows, is that they have that barreling down to them now in the second half of the Parliament, at which point you say, thanks, Rachel. Nonetheless, somewhere in there, in the incoherent package, is the twinge of a recognition that the only way things change in this country is if you accept that actually it's not completely fucked. There are things that can be done, and there are, and it will require state-led investment in order to do lots of them.
Just to talk about things that are fucked, people obviously will say, well, there's no money. Let me tell you where we can find money. £200 billion is being spent on Trident. 200 billion. And then it goes, well, Aaron, don't you want a nuclear deterrent? Even if you want, let's say you want that, fine. Put it on the F-35s, which, by the way, the Americans can turn off anyway if they really want to. Put it on the F-35s, which we're doing. We're now going to have a nuclear capability both with Trident and also with F-35s. And, put them just on F-35s and say, over a 10 to 15 year window, we want to have a ballistic missile program, which, by the way, a land-based one, which is much cheaper than Trident. You don't have to spend £200 billion doing it. But we're going back to the same point we've been repeatedly landing on, which is there's this puerile debate saying, well, either you support Trident or Britain shouldn't have nukes. How about we just put them on planes and that costs $1 billion rather than 200 billion and F-35s? We are going to spend over the entirety of that program £70 billion on these jets, which if the Americans break up with London, we won't be able to fly after 6 months. Right? We won't be able to do the software updates. We don't have the strategic reserves of rare earth metals that Washington has, etc. There are thousands of kilos, I think, hundreds at least, maybe thousands of kilos of rare earth metals in each F-35. They literally can't fly without this stuff. So the idea of servicing them and the software updates without the US ain't happening. We're spending 70 billion on it. 70 billion, if you wanted to spend that on medium and small cities and large towns in this country, my goodness, the things you could do. And I'm not just talking about redistributing and welfareism. I'm talking about supply side stuff. Build the nuclear power stations, build the renewable energy, build the schools, build the hospitals, build the trams. You could do it. We've made these choices not to. But it's really, again, we have a ruling class full of NPCs, right? This is Dominic Cummings' favourite phrase, but it's true. You can't say, well, how about we don't spend £200 billion on Trident? It seems like an awful lot of money. Because nobody can really say that. And you end up with people like Peter Mandelson with these sort of anodyne, pointless, cliched, pedestrian talking points, passing for, bold, innovative policy. I want to just go back to that point about the early 20th century, because again, political journalists love to say, this is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this, the collapse of the two-party system. And you're right to say we have. There's that great book, isn't there? The Strange Death of Liberal England by George Butterfield? Dangerfield or something Field? I feel like it can't be Dangerfield because he's talking about a dangerous moment in political history. The Strange Death of Liberal England. And you read it, and it's from that moment, basically, First World War through to the 1918 election, I think. And before the First World War as well, the Herbert Asquith, sort of Lloyd George liberal moment. I think the Liberals win this huge majority in 1906. But then they die within, 15 years later, they're dead as a political organisation. They never really come back. Anyway, you're reading that book and you're seeing Asquith, and he's having to deal with a Labour movement that's militant and it comes out of nowhere, a whole new political party, the Irish question. There's a civil war in this country because, of course, Ireland was a part of the UK. There's a civil war in this country, geopolitical sort of shifts, and it's crazy. Lloyd George has a home blown up by the suffragettes. So the idea that we now live in unprecedented and dangerous times. We've absolutely had chaotic sort of political moments in this country, and one of the ways that was corrected and stabilised was the emergence of the Labour Party. Right, so one party died, a new party emerges, and that creates a certain level of homeostasis and political, like I say, stability and consent. Consent is re-established with women getting the vote, Irish, separation. The formation of the Republic of Ireland obviously isn't perfect for a lot of reasons, but it's a building block on which you can rest a great deal of political consent in enough places. Certainly not Northern Ireland, for instance. But it lays the foundation for what we regard as sort of 20th century Britain, post-war Britain. Does the same need to happen now? Do we need to basically see one or two political parties die in order to establish a certain kind of stability? Or is the problem much bigger than that? Because you're saying that first past the post has these problems. Is it just that Reform dies, the Greens sort of replace Labour, and actually there's a new homeostasis? Or is that sort of pie in the sky?
No, I think that's one possible outcome. But I think for various reasons it's harder than it used to be to have that movement within the political system. So for one thing, parties own buildings and have vast amounts of money and various obligations and contracts and these kind of Byzantine systems. So that it's actually much harder for political parties to die in a sort of long-term sense than they used to. I mean, look at the various rump sort of socialist and communist parties which sort of cling on to a sort of tenuous existence largely because they own a building or two here or there. Or they have a bequest that sort of continues to operate them. So parties don't quite die in the same way that they used to. The other way of looking at this, or the other problem with this, is that it's not clear to me that forces find expression in politics so clearly as they did within the Labour Party or within the suffrage movement, i.e., I think it would be surprising to me if there were to emerge, within the next couple of years, a very thick Green Party. Feels to me like the conditions of political party membership are much more transactional, much less associational than they used to be. That makes them much less predictable, and it means that the kind of sustained assault needed to really change the political system is much harder to make endure. Now, one of the things that produces among political commentators on the left is a sort of, if only we were like the Italian Communist Party of yore, and we had these kind of thick social institutions, or even if we were like the early Independent Labour Party and had this sort of vast workplace presence and this kind of huge,
the workers' dreadnought.
Yeah,
with, George Bernard Shaw or God knows who writing a column.
My favorite title of any socialist newspaper ever. But yeah, so that seems. But the danger here is the kind of nostalgia, right? Like the idea that you can simply go back to that by wishing or by making a concerted effort. One of the stories in Britain of the last decade or so is of young people coming into political parties, attempting to renew them, attempting to redevelop this kind of associational basis, and finding themselves embittered, burnt out, used up, destroyed, and either resigning from politics entirely, or becoming so cynical that the prospect of kind of political work sort of becomes in some ways sort of indistinguishable from the sort of bureaucratic apparatus of the Labour Party itself. So there's something quite dangerous about attempting to re-envision these sort of nostalgized pasts, right? So partly that's because that took place in the CLP system, or because there were lots of blocks to expression, or lots of blocks to organisation. But there is something that has obviously been difficult about trying to re-thicken social relations in a political context. Now, there's lots of theories as to why, and I don't think any of them explain them completely cogently. But what we do know is that people like to express their political affiliations through relatively weak digital or digitally mediated links. That's simply a reality. It's something that one has to work with when attempting to make political change. Now, you can think of ways to bring people in and make them actors rather than spectators. That's one way of thinking about it. There are, one of the stories of the early 20th century is about politics being activated in domains that were not the conventionally political. So within women's lives, for instance. Now, those were lives that were largely excluded from politics, whether you were poor or whether you were rich. Women simply weren't party to the political decisions. That was something that changed, and that was a concerted change that was undertaken. Same is true of people in workplaces, organising in workplaces which were not conventionally political spaces. So there's lots to be thought about there about where the domain of politics is, where it needs to be taken, where it needs to be expressed, and that's one step removed from questions around, say, the vehicles that exist here. I think Reform is probably quite an unstable party. Whether ultimately it proves a catalyst for the re-emergence of a rather sharper-toothed Conservative Party, one that has much less of a strong boundary with the extreme right. So one of the stories of this election is that there's lots of rather creepy pro-Enoch Powell, pro-Oswald Mosley candidates standing for Reform, not disowned. Ex-BNP people definitely disowned, right? That's a hard line, or reasonably enforced.
Farage says it is, right?
Farage says it is. Powell, Mosley, that stuff is much less, that there are now sitting Reform councillors who have lots of time for Enoch Powell, who Larvey Oswald Mosley. This is a serious that is a taboo that has rapidly evaporated in British politics. So whether the medium term thing is that what that does is reconstitute conservatism in this country around a sort of much more strongly ethno-nationalist or exclusivist project. I say ethno-nationalist. Powell himself, quite a strange character in terms of how he thought about countries and whatever. But you could see that as being one outcome of reform.
Can I just say there was that great thing where the Gorton and Denton by-election, and Hannah Spencer was speaking, I think, in Urdu in one of the sort of the broadcasts, and people getting very upset, and there was a quite funny person, a sharp wit, saying this is the first British politician since Enoch Powell who can speak Urdu.
Yes, well, quite. But there is a question about what the Greens become, and whether they are, whether they follow the same sort of somewhat sclerotic arc as the Labour Party. So the answer is I don't know, right? I mean, it's very hard to try to disentangle one's own hopes and what is objectively going on here. I suppose what I will say, and I think it is important to recognise, is that you and I were talking about a green surge back in 2015, right? So it's been a long time coming, and for all of the commentators who want to say, oh, this party of sort of cuddly ecologists has been taken over by like deranged Corbynites who've been either expelled or left the Labour Party. Well, that's not quite true. There's been a long-term movement within the Greens to become much more serious about politics and to take the kind of representative structures of politics seriously. It's been going on for at least a couple of decades now.
I hate this turn that the media's taken. What happened to the lovely, cuddly Green Party when they just had one MP? The local Green Party where I live apparently refused to distribute leaflets until last year's local elections because it would be a waste of paper. You're obviously not going to win any councillors, are you? And that's the party they want back because it loses, because it makes no progress in terms of the political and policy debate in this country. The thing you said about thicker relations I find really interesting. Go back to 2019. Even after the general election defeat for Labour, people said that Corbynism was triumphant. It had won. Certainly before that general election, no. They have made changes in the Labour Party that can never be reversed. Turns out about 3 months later, they were all reversed, right? 3 months into the Starmer Starmer leadership, they were all reversed. Corbynism had no expression. I found myself in 2020 kind of shocked, actually. By the end of 2020, just thinking, it's gone. I don't have many... I don't have many advantages. I'm not a spectacularly smart person or whatever, but I think I can be quite honest and like blunt and brutal to myself. And I think before lots of other people around me, I was like, no, Corbynism is dead.
Yeah.
It's obviously dead. But it was apparent so quickly. But what's intriguing now, James, is the same is happening with Labour Together. Starmer has changed the party forever, has he? And all of a sudden he's collapsing and people are saying, well, maybe Ed Miliband will lead the party. What the hell? And who would his advisors be? Maybe he'd have James Schneider come in and help with comms? It's ridiculous. And so it does feel like we're now in a sort of political reality where that thickness which characterised radical political politics on the right or left is just dissipates. It's not there anymore. And I think you're right that Reformer are not in that category either. I suppose resilience is so shocking now because it's so rare. I think one of the reasons why, Iran has stunned the world is because it didn't collapse. It did what countries kind of used to do quite often, actually. If you look at the Polish-Russian War in the 1920s or the Finnish-Russian War or Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, they defended their country. But people are shocked because there was actually some sort of basic resilience. And we live in this strange world. I think it's partly because so much is mediated through online conversation and relationships that we find that kind of stunning. Again, if you go back to the Russian Civil War, the front line moving, St. Petersburg, defended once by Stalin, once by Trotsky. It almost fell. Lenin saying, no, leave St. Petersburg. We have to defend Moscow, the home of the revolution. If that was happening now, and this revolutionary cause had to leave St. Petersburg, a major city, everybody on X, it's over. It's over. We've lost. Actually, wars have ups and downs, and that's always been how it is. But the sort of affective nature of the community environment now means that you have no resilience. And I think, coming back to what we're talking about here, that's very obvious with political projects domestically. On the Greens, what's their ceiling?
one way of looking at it is to say British politics is increasingly divided into at least two blocks, right and left, progressive, reactive, whatever. Within that left or progressive bloc, which probably constitutes about 40% of the population, so you're including, say, Liberal Democrats, lots of Labour voters, and Greens in there, as well as maybe some sort of independent voters as well, tiny. I think control or hegemony of that bloc is not beyond the Green Party. It's a very tall order, and I think it's been wonderful that lots of people in the Greens have been congratulating themselves and each other over their successes in these elections. But if they want to take that seriously, then there's a lot to do in not very much time. And there are serious questions to answer there, because quite rightly, lots of people in the Labour Party will say, well, someone's got to hegemonise this bloc, and historically it has been us. And it's pretty risky, don't you think, to think that you might split this bloc in two in a period in which reform might hegemonise that other bloc. Now, so that's one way of looking at it. There are these two blocks, and then there's maybe a much smaller block of kind of voters in the centre who are actually quite strange voters in some ways, right? Like they're the last people who believe various things are working. I don't know if you saw that very strange video of Mark Gatiss, who is BBC actor, quite famous. I think it was on some sort of morning programme where he was just baffled. He was like, I don't understand why people hate Keir Starmer. The trains run on time. Have you taken a train recently, Mark? It's not in my experience.
Maybe he means TfL. TfL's superb.
Why does all this hatred come from? It's actually a really good question, why there's so much hatred, why there's so much anger in politics. But that sort of perspective on the world, it's a very limited perspective. I think, you have to be quite a successful urban, maybe even metropolitan, so maybe even only in London, maybe Manchester, can you start to think like that. Well, everything's all right, really. You probably own your own home outright. You're not subject to fluctuating mortgage rates. Probably don't have children because, can you imagine if you had children? And you would think, oh, my children won't be able to afford to live in the area that they grew up in. But everything's fine, really. Yeah. So this is a very, very small kind of group of people, really. Not completely insignificant electorally, but meaningful. So left and right bloc, those people in the centre. One other way of looking at it is that there are people who are still attached to the conventional parties, right? So includes those people in the centre and some people in each left and right bloc, right? So people who are relatively risk averse, who think, these people aren't handling it well, but the institutions of state are fine. And then there are people who are increasingly attracted to green and reform. And some of the polling on this is really interesting. Lots of those people share some pretty interesting commonalities. They're very, very distrustful of politicians. They're very, very distrustful of political institutions, but they're also very distrustful of lots of private institutions as well. They're strongly opposed to things like privatised utilities. They absolutely loathe private water in more or less similar numbers. So you can see, they're often very economically exposed. They often have very little savings. They often have relatively low to median income. They often live from kind of month to month, check to check. Some of them are economically vulnerable because they're pensioners, so they depend on, income not earned through work. Other benefits in that section as well. So you can see, can't you, that there are clear commonalities between these two kind of voters, which would seem initially, and let me say, on cultural issues, often they are very opposed to each other. But there is something interesting there. So there's that conventional sort of left-right split, but also this sort of strange centre and centrifugal split, right? Centre and dissident split. And, the holy grail in some ways for a populist green political project would be to attempt to unite them. Now, I'm not sure that's possible. I don't know whether that's possible, but I think it would be an interesting thing to think about, an interesting thing to consider seriously. Whether even if you can't unite them, whether you can make someone from say the reform side think, I don't want a Green government, and I don't want, Zach Wolanski in power, but maybe I could live with it. And that's a really interesting place to be in. And so, I think, but what that delivers to you is quite an unstable political structure. And again, I've talked here largely in terms of England. In both Wales and Scotland, there's the nationalist parties in play. There are differences there between Wales and Scotland. Obviously, in Scotland, the SNP is an incumbent party, so they probably fall towards that institutional centre. They still attract a lot of votes who see them as kind of insurgents of one kind or another. It's astonishing to me in some ways that after the obvious dissatisfaction with the SNP, that they more or less retained pretty strong control over sort of central belt politics in Scotland. So there are lots of things that are interesting about the Scottish result, but they had much less of that anti-incumbency effect. And whether that's because there are, the politics of the devolved administration versus Westminster allows some sort of the same thing that we used to do on a national level. We say, oh, well, it's all the Europeans' fault. And so you could disclaim there's an accountability sink somewhere for it. So all of that's the sort of dynamic that's in play. That hasn't really answered your question, has it? Where that green ceiling is, but it is an important and interesting question because that question of blocks and divisions and structures within politics is going to become more and more important as we bear down on 2029.
Yeah, I mean, for my money, the green ceiling depends on what kinds of questions they ask. And I don't think the left has been asking the right questions for quite a while, I have to say, or much of the left. And I think there's a very uncharitable sort of view of reform voters or reform curious voters. Now, many of them are voting for reform because they want lower immigration. Some violently so, some are racist, some just were shocked, and I think that's totally understandable, by what happens after Brexit, because they were told Brexit would mean lower immigration, and actually it changes very substantially, particularly after 2020. I think that radicalises lots of people, actually. But at the same time, I do think the rise of reform and the decline of consent for the two-party system goes hand in hand with the demise of the public realm. People look around their country in the last 15 years and it looks like shit, right? What do I mean? I mean HMOs, I mean fly tipping, I mean litter, I mean graffiti tags, local authorities having less money, things just not looking like they used to, the local pub closing, things cost more. And I feel that the left doesn't consider this stuff enough. If somebody lives on a terrace road and they find it hard to park and people are sort of building extensions in their HMOs, and there's about 35% more people on that road than there used to be, and they only notice the brown and black people, then I can see why they'd blame immigration. I can understand that, right? You should really be blaming HMO landlords and the fact we're not building enough houses in this country, but whatever. So I totally get that. If the local pub is shut, I get it. If there's graffiti everywhere and there's crap everywhere, I totally get it. And there's a great phrase in Italian, the bedroom is the opera of the poor man. I love it. What an Italian phrase.
It really is Italian.
Il letto è l'opera del povero, which means that, these people don't have the resources to have these joys that the very wealthy have. They have small joys. And the small joys these people are an affordable pint, a bit of peace and quiet, a nice night's sleep, basic civility, knowing your neighbours, knowing your fucking neighbours. We don't do that anymore. And I do feel like the radical left doesn't take that stuff seriously, or it's coded as socially conservative. What, having a nice pub at the end of the road? I quite like that, Is that socially conservative? Knowing your neighbours? I think that's quite nice. And some of that, of course, bleeds into bigotry and so on. Of course it does. But I think also lots of it stems from really justified stuff. And my feeling is if the Greens get on top of that, and of course I would say this because it's my personal view. Everything's their personal view is the answer to everything. But I feel like if the Greens get on top of that and actually they can grab some of that nostalgia, which is, I think, essentially social democratic, because you're talking about the public realm, I think it's quintessentially anti-Thatcherite, society actually does exist, then I think I don't know about hegemonizing a left bloc, but I think they could persuade lots of those people who either won't vote or they'll be reform curious or just outright vote reform. I do think that will happen. And I also agree that given the reform coalition is so unstable, somebody's going to have to pick up the pieces if it falls apart. And I think why can't that at least be in some part of the Green Party?
Yeah. I mean, so I think that's right. I mean, the assertion that society exists, and not only does society exist, but you have obligations to it.
Yeah.
Not just things you can take out of it, not just things you can expect from it, but things you are obliged to do as a citizen and a member of society. I mean, is the thing. I mean, it is the thing that can animate lots of this politics. I was thinking as you were speaking that one of the great errors of the Starmer government has been to imagine that because the rate of inflation was decreasing, the cost of living crisis was somehow over. I mean, this is insanity. Do you go to the supermarket and say, oh, it hasn't increased as much as it increased by last week? I feel wealthy again. No, you think 5 years ago, I earned less and somehow bought more. 5 years ago, this cost half of what it does now. Let's say I've progressed in my career over the course of the past decade. Why is my rent or my mortgage, if you're lucky enough to get a mortgage, still eating so much of my paycheck? The cost of living crisis hasn't gone away. I mean, it's going to return, with a screaming thunder as a result of the Iranian war. But it was always going to anyway, because, and this is an excellent argument for a green politics. It is precisely the case that energy input, food prices, other such factors are going to, are already, I keep saying are going to, but of course are already, sensible in the pocketbook of the ordinary citizen. So these questions aren't abstract. A question of being able to articulate them and articulate them in a way that doesn't sound completely bonkers is important. But I don't think it's beyond the realm of human possibility to do so. I mean, the idea that that people are going to the shops and feeling somehow better because things have not the prices aren't growing in quite so runaway fashion. It's simply ludicrous. It is baffling to me that the Labour Party could have lost sight of it. It just is utterly astounding.
Yeah.
But there you go.
Compare it to Zohran Mamdani, right? He was talking about, I don't even know what a halal is in American, $10 for a halal? What are you talking about? But I presume it means like a kebab.
Just like a kebab, right?
Like a shawarma or something. But anyway, he said we used to pay $8 and now it's $10. And that's such a great snapshot of, okay, things are a bit harder now. And I would love a government minister, I mean, who would it be? Sort of culture, I guess, or culture, communities, hospitality.
Sorry, culture, Lisa Nandy.
Yeah, invariably. Well, I'm thinking because it was historically culture and communities.
Yes,
it was sort of the least important department, but now it's changed. The local government reorganisation. Oh my god. Anyway, it would be the least talented person would go in to be slotted in there. But I would love a minister who's in charge of the hospitality industry saying, look, right now the median pint in this country is £6.50. I want to get it to £4. How do I do it? I'm going to talk to various trade associations. I'm going to talk to the CBI. They won't know anything there really is. I'm going to talk to various trade unions. I'm going to talk to various landlord organisations, the brewers. Because the conversation is, what you get in the media is, well, you just need to reduce NI contributions and then it'll be all magic. Well, hold on. We've only just increased NI contributions and a pint of lager was expensive before that anyway. Of course, a big chunk is energy costs, rent. Right? And then that would be great. And so here's what we need to do to get the average pint in this country to below £4. Here's what we need to do. Yes, some of that might be tax. Some of that might be that hospitality businesses don't pay the same rate of VAT. I think they shouldn't, personally, frankly. I think there are so many positive externalities from people eating and drinking together. I think it's like the number one best pill you could do for your mental health. It doesn't need to be alcoholic, just to be clear. That it shouldn't be treated in the same way as, I don't know, buying a games console, a game or something with 20% VAT. I think these things are different. So that would be the kind of conversation I want. But it's so, like you say, they don't think about these things in a substantial, concrete way. It's, well, the rate of CPI is 2.5%, so people must be fine. Any concluding remarks?
Yeah, it's something that we haven't talked about, but is worth saying, and I just come from what you're saying there. Rents. And I think it's really interesting with the release of these two pamphlets, so from the Tribune Group and the Labour for Growth or whatever, two kind of very close in some ways factions of the Labour Party, to quite far away, but they intervened into they've been coming for a while, but intervened into this kind of post-elections furore, both of them identify rents and rentiers and rentierism in particular as one of the great causes of the, what effectively I think we should start calling the British malaise. And until we sort that out, until we make it much less attractive to be a rentier, i.e. someone who has an asset and does nothing with it except collect rents from it, until we make it much less attractive to do that rather than do something productive, we will continue to have this sort of sense of, suppurating loss of vitality from lots of our lives and lots of our associational lives. You mentioned games console. It reminded me, of course, we have been through a period in which people were locked inside for a long time and were removed from sociality. I think we haven't seen the end of the after effects from COVID. I think lots of the weirdness in our political system, lots of the antipathy, lots of the virulence, lots of the hatred, and lots of the sense of isolation endures from that period. Last thing is, one of the things that people like Nigel Farage have profited from is the sense that someone, somewhere, is having a better life than you off the back of your work. Now, that is inarguably true. It's not usually the people Nigel Farage points you to, but there is a real and deep problem in our culture of people wanting to find ways to opt out of social existence of one kind or another. Here's the hack to profit as a slum landlord. Here's how to get the bag. Here's how to become an Instagram influencer and not have to work, really. All of this stuff, it is poisonous to a healthy society. And we've got to make it much, 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 much less attractive.
James Butler, a fabulous conversation, and I must say, an intriguing moment in British political life. Thank you.
Thank you.